Welcome to our series, In Conversation. Today's episode features two artists with a long history in the Pacific Northwest, Jaq Chartier and Katy Stone, both will be joining us over Zoom. I'm Judith Reinhardt of the J. Reinhardt Gallery here in Seattle, Washington. Thank you so much for joining us. Both Jaq and Katy push the envelope of experimentation with their installations and materials. I'm thrilled to be exhibiting works by both artists in our group exhibition, In Conversation, which is on view in the gallery through December 19th and online at jreinhardtgallery.com. Enjoy the conversation.
Hi, I'm Katy Stone, and I would describe my work as a combination of painting and sculpture, sculptural painting or painterly sculpture. It's actually something that one of my professors and dear friends, Karen Gans, has called 2.5D, and it's kind of this place that employs both elements of flatness and shallow relief, and it's kind of that in between space that's very characteristic of the work. And I use a lot of materials. I'm really interested in lightness, physical lightness, and also just conceptual lightness and ephemerality and transience. So those are some of the ways that I describe it. And I refer a lot to the natural world and kind of to processes or phenomenon.
Hi, I'm Jaq Chartier. I'm a Seattle painter. I would describe my work as sort of a cross between 2D sort of modernist painting and an art and science combination, exploring materials and how they actually interact with each other.
I'm influenced by kind of the forms of the natural world, but also the forces of the natural world. I'm also really interested in just, I mentioned materials, but like physical properties of materials. And I'm really interested in just aspects of light, shadow, projected light, color that is veiled and layering. So those are kind of two different tracks of ideas that are like tangible, direct influences or suggestions, and then also the actual way that materials work and how they result in what I make and what I choose to pursue.
I'm influenced by lots of things from science imagery that you would see under a microscope or creatures you'd see under the sea, and the interaction of materials and color. Color is my favorite thing. So I think everything I do in my studio is about playing with color and an excuse to keep exploring color.
Well, I'm super interested in Jaq's work because I've known Jaq for over 25 years, and she's a really close friend, and I've watched her work evolve over that time. And I love the way that her work just hits you in this really place of pulling you in and completely overwhelming your senses with the beauty of color and the subtle kind of dynamics at play, and just like it calls you into this whole other frame of mind. And it's really like something you can meditate on. And it really encourages you to engage beyond just your intellect. It brings you into the realm of visual art, like all the language of visual art, color, repetition, texture, and where that starts you, and then where it starts to bring in all the other different associations. So the way that it works on me physically and kind of emotionally is what I love the most about Jaq's work.
Katy and I have been working side by side in a lot of ways for a long time. We were at University of Washington together, and my first memory of Katy was that I would go into her studio and she would have all this amazing material, visceral kind of quality to her work that just made me go back into my studio and look at everything a second time. Like, oh, I didn't think about using that material that way. And her work has inspired me for ever since then, for many years, in her ability to take a simple material and she has a touch and a sense of nuance to how she works with materials that I find very poetic. And it's always interesting to me to see what she's going to do next, because it keeps evolving in this way that's very organic. Her work is organic, but it's also evolves in this way that one thing leads to another. And I think for me, it kind of reaffirms that in my own work, to just follow your own personal sense of what the materials are calling you to do and to explore.
One of the questions that I was going to ask you about your work has to do with the idea of suspension, and how do you think about that word? And the reason I was asking is I think that both of our work has a way that it floats. Like, I don't think about gravity when I look at your work. I feel more like I'm in a floating space. And I think that's one of my obsessions, is like lightness, and floatingness. So I was thinking about the idea of suspension.
Well, it's like perfect, because I always think of you as this person that has this poetic sense of words and how they inspire art. And I do that a lot. Like, I'll just open the dictionary at random and I'll try to look for a Katy word, like in the back of my mind. It's like a word that will open things up for me. And so suspension is a perfect one. I did a show recently called In Solution, and I like that title because I'm actually literally working with dyes and pigments that are in a solution and then using them. But there's also this idea of testing and looking for solutions to problems or figuring things out. But suspension is different but interesting in the same way. It's like this, like, I think we both look for this in-between place where things are not quite here or there. And that moving back and forth is I think where you find the next thing. It's like where one thing can inspire the next thing. And so in like suspension, I think of, like things are, like, I don't think of there being a bottom, although I do work, like you said, in a kind of traditional sort of format that's more formalist painting. So I always do have a sense of the bottom, like in this one behind you can sort of see this. I always leave this like light space at the bottom almost all the time.
Oh, yeah.
Because for me, I'm still looking at it like a traditional formalist modernist painting. I'm like old-fashioned in that way. But I think suspension is interesting in your work because you're working with materials that, it's not like the Duralar is really lightweight, but it's still, if it wasn't held in place, it would just drop to the floor. And so with the metal on the wall, but the way that you apply them, they look like they're just hovering there. They feel weightless. And it kind of creates that feeling that I have of going into another world. Mm-hmm. Like I don't feel like I'm standing in front of stuff on the wall. I feel like I'm entering into this other place where the things are kind of hovering of their own volition. So I don't know if that's what you had in mind, but what I think, because we're both working flat with materials that are liquid and then they dry, they by their own natural state create that feeling of not really being on the ground, like when you tip them up. You know what I mean? Because they're not when you make them.
Right.
Gravity is like going from the front to the back once it's up on the wall, and that's not how we think of gravity, so it kind of defies it.
Yeah.
Okay?
That turns into that really interesting place for me anyway, when I never even thought about it really, but we both work flat and then we present the work generally on the wall. So you're right. Like, it doesn't, I mean, I do falling down things, but like it doesn't feel like there's gravity in the drips because I'm painting them flat. So
Yeah.
there isn't gravity in that way, which is just kind of interesting.
Well, and in some way, we know, even if we don't know it consciously, when we see something, we have a sense of that, I think.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I was thinking too about suspension, like as being this state. I think both of our work has this way that we embed time into it. Like, and so, and like my work always has a lot of motion, but it's also very still.
Mhm.
And your work also has that quality because you're capturing or freezing a moment when these things dried, but the way that you use repetition and you build them and the chart-like nature of the compositional structure of the paintings, it implies this continuum kind of thing. And I'm always trying to feel like my work is always trying to tap into some kind of feeling of like a glimpse of a continuum somehow, or a frozen moment in a process. And I mean, some of your pieces are literally like the Sun Test series. That's one that's using time in a very overt way. But yeah, I think time is embedded in both of our work. So I was also kind of thinking about suspension as it relates to time or stillness and ongoingness.
Or suspending things in time. Well, and right now I'm going to be making paintings as opposed to sun tests, where more and more I want to start bringing in things that are going to change over time. So the
Oh,
painting won't just be. I mean, they've never really been just a frozen moment, because some of the materials are not typical art materials, and they're not light fast, and they will slowly evolve a bit. But I typically try to weed those really fugitive colors out of my paintings. I use them in the sun test, but not in the actual paintings that are sold as paintings. But now that I'm doing all these sun tests, I want to make paintings that kind of, it's like, I don't know, it's going to be challenging because I don't know about galleries and collectors, whether they want to buy things that don't stay the same. So it's like pushing on. I mean, with painting, it feels like there's nothing new to do. And yet when you start talking about something that's going to change, everybody goes, what's it going to look like? It's like, I don't know.
right.
They don't like that. So we'll see. It's going to be but so the idea of painting or sculpture not being static or frozen.
Yeah, like non-fixedness.
Yeah.
As
So
a
one of the things I wanted to ask you about is that transition between 2D and 3D or 2.5D, where like, how do you think about one informing the other when you're working and when you're thinking about work?
Well, I think it's totally conceptually related to that idea of like non-fixedness. Like it's organic, but it's synthetic, and it's never a depiction. It's suggestive of something in nature, or it's suggestive of a totally flat shape, but it's not fully 3D. And that kind of in between space is just super interesting. Like I made a conscious decision way back when we met in grad school, where I was like, I'm not making pictures of something, I'm making objects.
Right.
That kind of material presence of the object is what really stood out for me, was that I wanted to make things that had this objectness. But then at the same time, like there's something about them when they're always made of flat things. And I love thin. I thought recently everything I gravitate toward is thin. And I like that way that like it's in between like a solid tactical thing you can grab onto, and then it's also like so thin that it has no body or substance at all. And so that's just compelling to me on a conceptual level. And I think that's why I work that way, because it's like it's more interesting and objecty, and yet I don't think of myself as a sculptor at all. I wanted to say one thing that's been challenging for me, and you've done it, Jack, in maybe a way that doesn't feel as limiting, but I always think of my work as really about installation, and I really love to create environments that are immersive for people to enter, where more than one piece can dialogue with itself. You do that in your work by having multiple panels that dialogue with themselves,
Yeah.
and so it's like I think both of us are more interested in less of like the single object. It's more of like this putting into motion and showing glimpses of a process that just keeps happening and growing and building. And so like with my work, in a gallery setting, it's an object on the wall, but really I like to break down the plane of the wall and the picture plane. So I put things on the floor, and things fall off the wall and go onto the floor and drape and stick out. And I don't usually use the ceiling, but it's just like I feel like it's hard sometimes when you want your practice to be considered at its widest sense, this very immersive thing, and then sometimes are limited by just the constraints of having to boil it down to one object that's on the wall.
Yeah.
Like, how do you think about that in your own work? Like, would you always rather have a room of them dialoguing with each other? Like, is it hard to separate them out?
Well, it's one of the great things about being able to show in a gallery space. It's like when you have a solo show and you can really conceive of the whole environment. Um, and there's been so many art fairs lately that having your piece in amongst just one piece in amongst all of that cacophony, it's really hard to feel like you can see it.
Yeah,
Although if you're used to looking at work, you can still kind of go into your own little zone when you look at something. And that's kind of what I'm always trying to do, is get somebody to feel like they fall into my world for a minute. And, it's like you're weaving a spell that they get captured in. And then maybe most people it goes right by them, but there's always a few people who, just like you and I, when we see work, there's something will grab you and you just zone in on it. Like you would do if you're taking a walk in the woods and you find some little thing, like a little gem. So, but I know what you're saying about maybe what you're moving into is needing to do big museum shows where you can create a giant, giant world.
That's my favorite thing to do. And also that it's temporary. I love something's really compelling to me about making work that is temporary.
Yeah, see, that's where we're different.
Yeah.
I like, even when I see art calls for temporary installations, I just go, no. I want to make an object, and I want it to be something that feels permanent, even though it's changing and evolving.
Mm-hmm.
But that environment. So that's one thing about your work that I've always been very curious about, but I don't see it as my language at all, is the installation space or the 2.5 to 3D space. Working in that, I mean, you've been doing that for the whole time. Remember that yarn and weird found thrift store stuff? You did that whole environment. I mean, to me, they're just magical. But it's not anything that I do. It's like not my world. It's where we kind of divide off.
Yeah, right. We do kind of in that way. But
Well, part of it too is that there's what you do in the studio for yourself, and then what you do that's more out in the world, like presenting your work in a more public setting. And the work that we do, I think, in the studio, that's just for us, that you wouldn't even think of selling or showing, I think is kind of like what Karen Gans, going back to our instructor from grad school, used to talk about drawing, like drawing, not just pencil on paper, but drawing up from the well of your ideas and who you are, and like trying to find a way to get that into the final work is always the challenge. Like how do you keep feeding it from that well when the well is trying to get you to do something that isn't marketable? It's like finding that, navigating that place. Like for me, the sun tests have been a really good example of that. I was making all these little tests on the side that I couldn't show in the gallery because they would things disappear. By the time I'd have a show, I couldn't show the piece because it was already, kind of washed out. But I love that the colors change. I love that the inks disappear or they go from one color to another. So that for me was what I would consider kind of a drawing thing in the background, like playing around with that, but not showing it. It was just for me. And to finally find a way to show it has really been, exciting, because I feel like it's taking me to that next place that I needed to go.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's kind of opening your world, but also grounding it foundationally, because it's always been about exploration and change and what happens when you do this to this. And then your work is the physical record of that experimentation, and the fact that it's disappearing, it's so poignant, really. And so the way that you've found a way, but even if you didn't, there's something just really conceptually compelling about the idea of, it's like in the territory of the erased drawing, and so it's like there's that stream of making something that is going to disappear,
or like what you were saying, something that's temporary, and it disappears in a different way.
And one of the things that I think about a lot is, like, I feel like the reason that I make art is there's something about being human, where every moment we're alive, you also know that you're going to die. Like, so I think in some level, all artists are compelled by death for some reason. Like,
especially right now, it's like,
God. And then, like, the passage of time and kind of wanting to freeze everything and have it be, like, to hold it somehow, and, like, to have permanence. And, like, we make these things because it's like a way of fixing something in time and stopping time. And that's part of the reason, like, I make constructions, and that's part of the reason that I make things with lots of parts. It's like a way of admitting, like, this is going to be vulnerable to change. This is a construction, just like everything else in our world, And there's something that's just like one of those kind of grounding reasons that people are compelled to make art, like why we're making art. We're human beings, and we're all mortal.
There's also this sense of, what do you want to be doing with your time? Like, where do you want to be in your day? What do you want to be looking at? Like, as an artist, for me, it comes back down to, what do I want to look at? What kind of resonance world do I, like, there's lots of different types of resonance. What resonance do I want to be in? Like, listening to music. You choose music because it sets a kind of tone or mood for where you want to be and what you want to feel. And making art's the same way. You're kind of in a place, and then hopefully when people look at it, you bring them into that place for a moment. And I want it to be something beautiful, not something that makes people feel bad. And it's not dissing anybody else's work. I'm just saying, for me, I want to spend my time making things that make me feel good. And so it's like a type of meditation, where you're.
Right. Well, like I'm thinking about, because your work does that to me, the idea of the trance state or contemplation, and a contemplative state. And when I make work, I'm so attuned to the composition. Everything is very intentional, because I can tell when I make things that keep one's eye moving. And that totally is a compositional choice. And when you can tell when you've composed something and you freeze it and it stops, or when you open it up and your eye just can't quit moving. And I realized, like, a while ago, that's a thing that I do, that's like seeking a trance state. And I want that for people, that when they look at my work, and I want that for myself when I look at my work, and I get that when I look at your work, it puts me into this kind of
Good.
trance state. Yeah.
That's what I want.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I sort of feel like it's like a magician weaving a spell, and you want people to fall into the spell and not like. So for me, anything that would distract you, like I spend hours and hours making these meticulous panels that are just like completely neutral by the time you're done. And it's because whenever I've made panels like a really quick way and just trying to get it done, then I notice all this stuff that I don't want my eye distracted by. So it's like you weed out anything that breaks the spell, whatever way that requires. You know what I mean?
Right. And in that way, then I think our work's different, because your work like is so seamless that there's really not ever a time where the spell is broken. And I break the spell of my own work because I'm like how it'll be this thing, and then you're like, oh, but it's constructed. And oh, but those are it's pinned to the wall, it's not floating. And I'm sort of interested in that moment and the tension between when you have an illusion and then when you admit like you demonstrate or show you're honest about the fact that it's an illusion.
Yeah.
And this
I would challenge you though, you don't just pin it to the wall any old way.
no, right, it's true.
But you do it in this way that does keep you somewhat in the spell because it's beautifully done. It's so well crafted that you don't notice anything being kind of screwed up. You know,
Right.
not just jammed in there and then it fell out, made an extra hole. I mean, it's, you know what I mean? It's like a meticulous quality. And that meticulousness is because it's part of a certain aesthetic resonant sensibility that is part of the spell.
Yeah, that's true.
Scotch tape up there with your fingerprint all over it. Although you've made
Right.
work that's more like that. Your drawings were like that, more kind of like.
Yeah, my older work was more like that. And you're right, because like some things can take you out of it, take you out of the spell, and some things can't. I was just interested in this idea that this writer, whose name is William S. Wilson, talked about the idea of a non-deceptive illusion. And I'm really compelled by that idea.
Yeah. Well, and so, yeah, what you're saying is that it's like I will go right up and look behind, like when I look at art and like, how is that made? What's going on there? And I think, you know, one of the reasons I write notes on my work is the notes are first and foremost for me, because I literally want to know what color was that and if something interesting happens. But it's also part of that thing of like the notes on how to make the work is kind of right there if you knew how to, if you wanted to read it. So in a way, that's kind of a way of breaking the spell too. So, but yeah,
but that's interesting, and it's not contrived. Like it's part of, like, it's embedded in the work and the honesty of you and the directness of you just being like, well, this is part of it. That's what these notes are, and I'm not going to overly aestheticize it by erasing them and making this perfect thing. Like that's in a way the same thing that I'm talking about, of like a non-deceptive illusion.
Yeah. Like for me, each painting is a real test and a real chart of what happened. And for me to make the notes on some other piece of paper of like what I use, it's just not the most, I'm just doing the most direct way. It's like, here's the colors. And the other thing for me that's maybe different is over time I've developed this set of rules. Like certain things are just not allowed in. If they don't support the actual test, making a test, if it's gratuitous just because it might look cool. And sometimes I hate that. Like I really don't want to, I want more freedom to just make whatever. But every time I try it, I just find myself coming right back. Like the rules are what keep me moving forward. I used to be an Abex painter, and you just throw everything at the painting. And so that impulse is still in the back of my mind, but I feel like I'm just reinventing the wheel every time. and it doesn't lead to the next thing. So, but I feel like you also have a certain language of materials and marks that you use now, and you don't just throw everything at the wall anymore either.
No, I don't. And I had a moment because for the first 10 years of my artistic practice, really, or maybe not quite that long, I was just purely worked with abstraction. And then I crossed over the threshold into nameable things, like, and having the subject matter of my work be grounded in um, observable, nameable things in the world around us. And once I crossed that threshold, I could never go back to just pure formalism. It felt empty in some way. And so I always kind of feel like I'm on this continuum back and forth between abstraction and representation, and I keep playing with it, and I keep going back toward more and more abstraction, but I can't ever really approach anything as just pure formal abstraction anymore. Even though I love that, it's like my own little rule system is like there needs to be something that's alluded to that's beyond just.
Well, and I think I'm the same way, like, because my work, even though it looks like formal abstraction, there's always this other thing going on that's driving the work from underneath.
Mm-hmm.
And without that there, it feels empty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I feel like it doesn't, it feels like a design project, but it doesn't go anywhere, and it doesn't lead to the next. I mean, as an artist, I'm always looking for the work to lead me to the next piece. And if it's a dead end, if it just comes to a dead end, there's no more work to do. You know what I mean? And so I always feel like the best paintings are the ones that kind of open up more questions.
Okay, so what are you working on right now in your studio? What is that next thing, that next question that you're really excited about?
Well, let me change my background. I'm still like deeply into these sun tests. So I've got this current group of sun tests. This is one. It's a little round.
Oh,
This is
yeah.
how it looks right now. And in the background is how it looked on the first day before it was exposed to light. And so this is just an example of using a lot of colors that disappear, which I just can't get enough of it right now. I mean, it's a new series for me, so that's fine. And also Dirk, my husband Dirk, just got me these new inks, Birmingham Pen Company in Pittsburgh. And I'm literally opening them up right now. I just got them. They're wrapped in this beautiful paper. And so it's like a whole bunch of new inks for me to play with.
Oh, cool.
I don't even know what they're going to do. And it's like, I only got like 7 or 8 of them, but there's more. This one's called Marmalade.
Oh my God.
And, whenever I get this kind of thing, it's like a whole new bunch of tests to do. And so I just have endless amounts of work to do, which is exciting. So how about you, Katy? What are you working on?
Well, what I'm super excited about is that I'm working on, I just was awarded a commission for the Port of Corpus Christi, and it's going to be made of 20,000 silver paillettes that are 3/4 inch diameter, that are metallic, that are, I had some like nearby, but I can't really hold them up, but they're kind of made of the same Duralar material. And it started as a temporary installation that I did a couple of years ago at a residency at Oxbow in Seattle. And now I'm doing a permanent piece using that same material. And it's going to be 15 feet by 45 feet. And I'm so excited about it. And it'll be completed in the spring. So that's kind of cool. Okay, cool.
This has been fun, Katy. It's been really great to catch up with you and see your face on the screen, if not in person.
Yeah, it's been great to see you too. Thank you too. It was really fun talking. I loved getting to talk a little bit more about some of the ideas behind things and the commonalities.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And thank you, Judith, for having us.
Thanks, Judith. I wish we could have done this in person, but this is kind of great for being creative and doing what we can right now.
Thank you, Jaq, and thank you, Katy, for that wonderful insight into your work and process. There's a lot to love about your fantastic pieces, and I'm excited to see what's next for both of you. For more information, visit us online at jreinhardtgallery.com and sign up for our newsletter to stay connected. You can also follow us on Instagram at jreinhardtgallery and subscribe to our YouTube channel to be the first to know when our new videos launch. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.